At 12:47 p.m. on February 15, 1944, as the Abbey of Monte Cassino crumbled under Allied bombs, Corporal Patrick Wheeler pressed his cheek against the stock of his borrowed Springfield 30-06, staring through his scope at a 3-inch gap in a concrete wall 480 yards across the frozen Rapido River Valley. Inside that bunker sat 5 German officers coordinating an artillery umbrella that had already killed 47 Americans in 2 days. The position was architecturally invincible, 3 feet of reinforced concrete, no direct line of sight, protected by counter-snipers who had already picked off 4 Allied marksmen. Conventional wisdom said the target was untouchable. In the next 11 minutes, Wheeler would fire 5 shots that no one heard, banking .30-06 rounds off an internal steel I-beam to kill men hidden behind walls, using physics that military doctrine said didn't exist. Within 8 weeks, his ghost technique would spread through enlisted ranks across the Italian theater, neutralizing 89 impossible strongpoints and saving an estimated 381 Allied lives. This is the story of how a Boston pool hall hustler and crane rigger used the law of reflection to rewrite the rules of engagement and was nearly court-martialed for it. Boston, 1936. The smoke in McGinty's pool hall on Dorchester Avenue hung so thick that Patrick Wheeler couldn't see the far wall, but he could see the geometry. That was all that mattered. He was 14 years old, $63 in debt to Tommy Castellano, and holding a warped house cue that pulled left on every stroke. The high rollers had their custom McDermott sticks with leather grips and perfectly balanced weights. Patrick had chalk dust and a brain that saw angles the way other kids saw baseball cards. Tommy stood across the table, grinning around a cigarette, his $200 cue gleaming under the single hanging bulb. "Straight shot, kid. 8-ball, corner pocket. You sink it, we're square. You miss, you owe me another 20. The 8-ball sat frozen against the rail, a direct shot blocked completely by Tommy's deliberately placed solids. It was a hustle within a hustle, the kind of setup that separated boys from men in places like McGinty's. Patrick chalked his cue slowly, buying time his hands didn't need, but his mind did. His father, a merchant marine who died when Patrick was 9, had left him exactly 2 things, a toolbox and a piece of advice whispered through morphine haze at Boston City Hospital. "Straight lines are for rich men, Patty. Poor men gotta learn the angles." Patrick studied the table. The 8-ball couldn't go direct, but the far rail was clean. If he could bank the cue ball off the cushion at exactly 43 degrees, the law of reflection would do the rest. Angle of incidence equals angle of reflection. What goes in must come out, mirrored and true. He didn't aim for the 8-ball. He aimed for the point on the rail where geometry became destiny. The crack of contact echoed through McGinty's, and the cue ball carved a perfect V pattern across the felt, kissing the 8-ball at an angle that sent it rolling toward the corner pocket like it had been born there. Tommy's grin died. The 8-ball dropped with a sound like a nail in a coffin. "Lucky shot," Tommy muttered, but everyone in McGinty's knew better. Patrick Wheeler didn't believe in luck. He believed in angles, reflection, and the cold mathematics that turned impossible shots into inevitabilities. 8 years later, in a frozen valley in Italy, he would use the same principle to kill men who thought concrete could protect them from geometry. By 1938, Patrick Wheeler had traded chalk dust for steel dust. The Charlestown Navy Yard paid $1.12 an hour for men willing to work the derricks that lifted battleship components weighing more than most Boston tenements. At 17, Patrick was the youngest crane rigger on the docks, but he had something the older men didn't. He could see the skeleton underneath the skin. While veteran riggers relied on decades of muscle memory and gut instinct, Patrick calculated load paths the way other men read newspapers. His foreman, Frank Kowalski, a Polish immigrant with hands like catcher's mitts and a back destroyed by 30 years of manual labor, noticed it first. "Kid, you're going to get someone killed staring at blueprints instead of watching your cables." They were hoisting a 16-ton gun turret assembly onto the USS Massachusetts, a job that required 4 cranes working in perfect synchronization. Patrick stood motionless, his eyes tracing the I-beams inside the skeletal frame of the partially constructed battleship. "The portside crane's gonna fail," Patrick said quietly. "Not the cable, the beam." Frank laughed until Patrick pointed at the expansion joint where 2 steel I-beams met at the ship's frame. "It's 87 degrees today. That beam's been baking in direct sun since 0600. Steel expands at 6.5 millionths of an inch per degree Fahrenheit. That's half an inch of thermal expansion pushing against a cold side beam that's been in shadow all morning. The stress is concentrating right there at the weld point." Frank stopped laughing. He called the engineers. They found a hairline fracture exactly where Patrick said it would be. The beam would have collapsed under load, dropping 16 tons of steel onto the deck crew below. Patrick spent his lunch breaks studying the way buildings breathed. Steel wasn't static, it was alive, expanding in heat, contracting in cold, flexing under stress in ways that followed predictable mathematical rules. He learned that every structure had gaps, expansion joints designed to prevent the very catastrophic failures that would occur if architects tried to build rigid, inflexible fortresses. These gaps were necessary vulnerabilities, 3 inches of engineered space into the bones of every building to prevent the entire skeleton from shattering. The engineers at the Navy Yard started asking Patrick to review structural stress calculations. Frank stopped calling him kid and started calling him professor, half mocking, half respectful. But Patrick wasn't interested in degrees or official recognition. He was interested in the truth, that every structure, no matter how solid it looked from the outside, had seams, and seams could be exploited by anyone who understood that strength and flexibility were not opposites, but partners in an eternal mathematical dance. 6 years later, staring at a German bunker through a rifle scope, Patrick would remember that buildings always had gaps, and gaps were just angles waiting to be calculated. Fort Benning, Georgia, August 1942. Captain Thornton Hayes stood at the front of the sweltering classroom, his West Point ring catching the afternoon light as he tapped a pointer against a tactical map of a fortified position. "Gentlemen, when faced with hardened enemy structures, you engage with combined arms, artillery suppression, infantry assault, armor support. You do not, under any circumstances, attempt to outsmart architecture with parlor tricks." His eyes landed on Patrick Wheeler, who sat in the back row with a notebook full of sketches that had nothing to do with the approved curriculum. Wheeler had been at Fort Benning for 6 weeks, assigned to the Army's newly expanded sniper training program after his shooting scores at basic training caught someone's attention. But the scores that impressed the sergeants annoyed Captain Hayes, a man who believed that warfare was a gentleman's profession best practiced by gentlemen officers who understood that innovation was just indiscipline wearing a clever disguise. "Corporal Wheeler," Hayes said, his voice dripping with the particular condescension reserved for enlisted men who forgot their place, "perhaps you'd like to share your alternative tactical analysis with the class." Patrick looked up from his notebook, where he'd been calculating ricochet angles off steel surfaces. The other trainees shifted uncomfortably. Hayes continued, "I've been reviewing your qualification reports. Your instructors note that you refuse to take standard shots, that you're constantly requesting permission to engage targets using, and I quote, reflected trajectory paths. Would you care to explain this pool hall physics to men who studied actual warfare at actual institutions?" Patrick stood slowly. "Sir, the law of reflection isn't pool hall physics. It's physics. Angle of incidence equals angle of reflection. A projectile striking a hard surface at a shallow angle will deflect predictably. If you know the surface composition and the angle of impact, you can calculate—" Hayes cut him off with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Calculate, son? This is combat, not a Navy Yard crane operation. The Germans aren't going to wait while you pull out a protractor and do arithmetic. Real soldiers take real shots at real targets they can actually see." The classroom erupted in nervous laughter. Patrick remained standing. "Sir, what if the target can't be seen directly? What if the only way to—" Hayes slammed his pointer on the desk. "Then you call in artillery, Corporal. You don't waste ammunition on fantasy shots that exist only in your working-class imagination. Dismissed." Patrick sat down, his jaw tight, his notebook filled with calculations that Captain Thornton Hayes would never understand because he'd never had to beat a man with better equipment. 16 months later, Hayes would write a report recommending Wheeler for court-martial. By then, Wheeler's fantasy shots would have saved more lives than Hayes's textbook tactics ever could. Hit subscribe if you believe true talent should be celebrated, not suppressed by jealous gatekeepers. Only those who fear innovation will skip this. The Rapido River Valley, February 12, 1944. Sergeant David Morrison died following orders at 0647 hours, which made him the 11th man that week to trust the manual more than his instincts. Patrick Wheeler watched it happen from 70 yards back, powerless to stop the geometry of stupidity that sent good men into mathematically certain death. Strong Point 7 sat on the far side of the valley like a concrete tumor, a reinforced German observation bunker that coordinated artillery strikes with surgical precision. Inside, 5 officers operated with impunity, protected by 3 feet of poured concrete, overlapping fields of fire, and the comfortable knowledge that Allied doctrine had no answer for their position. The manual said flanking maneuvers. The manual said suppressing fire and infantry assault. The manual had already killed 17 Americans in 3 days. Morrison had been Patrick's squad leader since Tunisia, a Chicago firefighter who treated his men like family and the Army Field Manual like scripture. That morning, he'd gathered the squad in the pre-dawn cold and laid out the attack plan exactly as headquarters dictated. We advance in 2 columns, use smoke for concealment, establish a base of fire at 200 yards, then assault through the wire. Patrick had tried to stop him. "Sarge, that bunker has interlocking fire lanes. The smoke won't matter. They're shooting at coordinates, not targets. We need to—" Morrison cut him off gently, the way you'd quiet a child afraid of the dark. "Wheeler, I know you've got ideas, but we followed the plan. That's how we stay alive." The smoke grenades went up at 0645. By 0647, German machine guns were chewing through Morrison's columns with the mechanical efficiency of men who'd done this 100 times before. Patrick watched Morrison take 3 rounds across the chest, watched him fall into the frozen mud, still clutching the manual's approved approach that had just killed him. 4 other men went down in the same assault. 2 more would die before medics could reach them. That night, Patrick sat in his foxhole, staring at Strong Point 7 through borrowed binoculars, ignoring the cold that turned his breath to fog. He wasn't looking at the bunker's firing slits or the obvious approaches. He was looking at the structure itself, searching for the skeleton beneath the concrete skin. And there, barely visible in the fading light, he saw it, a 3-inch expansion joint where the main wall met the reinforced roof support, a gap, a seam, a vulnerability that existed because German engineers, like all engineers, understood that rigid structures shatter under stress. The gap was 480 yards away, barely wider than his fist, and protected by an architecture that made direct fire impossible. But Patrick Wheeler had spent his life beating impossible odds by refusing to take straight shots. He pulled out his notebook and started calculating angles that would have made Captain Hayes laugh and Sergeant Morrison nervous. By morning, he'd have a solution. By afternoon, 5 German officers would be dead, killed by a man they never saw, using physics they never considered. February 13th, 0823 hours. Captain Robert Hendricks listened to Patrick Wheeler's proposal for exactly 90 seconds before deciding it was insane. They stood in a supply tent that smelled like diesel and wet canvas, and Patrick was trying to explain fourth-dimensional physics using sketches drawn on a crumpled Lucky Strike pack. "You want to shoot through a wall," Hendricks said flatly. "Not through, around, inside." Patrick spread the cigarette pack flat on an ammunition crate, his finger tracing the diagram he'd drawn in the foxhole darkness. Every concrete structure has expansion joints. Without them, thermal expansion would crack the entire building. The Germans engineered a 3-inch gap where the main wall meets the internal support frame. That gap exposes a steel I-beam that runs the length of the bunker's interior. Hendricks rubbed his eyes. He'd slept 4 hours in 3 days, and now he had a corporal proposing what sounded like a carnival trick. Wheeler, even if this gap exists, even if you could thread a bullet through a 3-inch slot at 480 yards, which you can't, what exactly happens when your round hits this magical beam? Patrick's voice remained calm, the same tone he'd used explaining thermal expansion to Frank Kowalski at the Navy Yard. The beam is positioned at approximately 43 degrees relative to my firing position. A .30-06 round striking steel at that angle will deflect according to the law of reflection. Angle of incidence equals angle of reflection. The bullet will bank off the beam and travel into the bunker's interior space where the officers are positioned. Hendricks stared at him. "You learned this shooting pool?" Patrick didn't blink. "I learned this understanding that structures breathe. Steel expands 6.5 millionths of an inch per degree Fahrenheit. Concrete expands at a different rate. Engineers compensate by building in gaps. Those gaps are vulnerabilities that exist in every fortified position ever constructed. The Germans didn't build a fortress. They built a geometry problem with a solution." The captain picked up the cigarette pack, studying the crude diagrams that would have been laughed out of any West Point classroom. "This is mathematical madness, Wheeler. You're asking me to authorize ammunition expenditure for a shot that violates every principle of direct fire doctrine." Patrick met his eyes. "Sir, Morrison died yesterday following doctrine. 4 others died with him. That bunker is killing 8 men a day. I can stop it with 5 rounds, or we can send another squad to die doing it the approved way." Hendricks was silent for a long moment, listening to the distant rumble of artillery that meant more men were dying while he stood in a supply tent debating physics with a pool hall hustler. Finally, he nodded. "You get 1 attempt, Wheeler. You miss, you never mention this lunacy again. Clear?" Patrick folded the cigarette pack carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "I won't miss, sir. The math doesn't allow for it." He walked out into the cold morning air, already calculating wind speed and the thermal expansion coefficient of sun-heated German steel. February 15th, 12:47 hours. Patrick Wheeler lay in the mud behind a collapsed stone wall, his Springfield .30-06 resting on a sandbag he'd positioned with the precision of a surgeon preparing an operating table. The temperature was 41 degrees Fahrenheit, humidity at 73%, barometric pressure dropping. These weren't details, they were variables in an equation where the answer was life or death. Air density. At sea level and 59 degrees, air has a standard density that produces predictable bullet drop, but the Rapido Valley sat at 387 feet elevation in winter cold, which meant denser air, which meant increased drag on the projectile. Patrick calculated a 2.3% increase in air resistance over standard conditions. His .30-06 round would lose approximately 47 feet per second of velocity by the time it reached the bunker. He adjusted his scope elevation accordingly, compensating for the extra drop. Wind was negligible, less than 4 miles per hour from the northwest. Patrick ignored it. The real problem was the steel. Through his scope, he could see the 3-inch expansion gap, a vertical shadow against the concrete face. Beyond it, invisible but mathematically certain, was the I-beam. German structural steel, probably Krupp manufacturing, positioned at 43 degrees relative to his firing line. When his rounds struck that beam at 2,100 feet per second, the deflection coefficient would determine whether the bullet caromed into the bunker's interior or shattered into useless fragments. The deflection coefficient depended on 3 factors: angle of impact, bullet composition, and surface hardness. A .30-06 round has a copper-jacketed lead core. German I-beams are medium carbon steel, Rockwell hardness approximately C25. At 43 degrees, striking at high velocity, the bullet would deform slightly but maintain structural integrity. The copper jacket would grip the steel surface for microseconds, just long enough for the law of reflection to redirect the projectile's momentum. Angle of incidence, 43 degrees. Angle of reflection, 43 degrees, mirrored across the beam's surface normal. Patrick made the final calculation in his head. If the beam was positioned where he believed it was, and if the thermal expansion from 3 hours of midday sun hadn't shifted it more than a quarter inch, and if the bullet maintained 68% of its velocity after deflection, it would travel another 18 feet into the bunker at a trajectory that intersected with the documented position of the German command station. He exhaled slowly, letting his heart rate drop below 60 beats per minute. The crosshairs settled on empty air, 3 inches left of the concrete wall, aimed at nothing, aimed at everything. His finger took up the trigger slack. The math didn't allow for failure. The math never had. The first shot broke the silence at 12:47 hours. Through his scope, Patrick saw nothing, just the gap, the shadow, the invisible geometry inside. He worked the bolt, ejected the spent casing, chambered another round. 47 seconds passed. The bunker remained silent. No return fire, no alarm. Then, faintly, he heard it, shouting in German, confused and sharp. Officer 1 was down. Patrick adjusted for the thermal shift. The steel beam had been baking in direct sunlight for 3 hours. It would have expanded, shifted the angle by perhaps half a degree. He calculated the new deflection path, moved his point of aim 2 inches right. The second shot cracked across the valley at 12:49 hours. More shouting from inside the bunker, this time edged with panic. The Germans were searching for a muzzle flash that didn't exist, scanning the wrong angles, looking for an enemy who was shooting through their walls. Officer 2 was down. By the third shot at 12:51 hours, the Germans understood they were under attack, but not how. Patrick watched through his scope as soldiers emerged from the bunker's side entrance, frantically scanning the hillside, pointing at positions that would have made sense if warfare followed straight lines. They were looking for a sniper in a tree line 200 yards north. They were looking for a flanking position to the east. They were not looking at the collapsed stone wall 480 yards to the south, where a corporal was banking bullets off their own structural supports. Officer 3 was down. The fourth shot at 12:53 hours triggered chaos. German soldiers dove for cover, screaming about ghosts, about American hexerai, witchcraft. A machine gun team opened fire on empty hillside, wasting ammunition on shadows. Patrick remained motionless, his breathing steady, his calculations perfect. The sun was higher now, the beam expanding further. He adjusted again, threading the needle through geometry that shouldn't exist. Officer 4 was down. At 12:55 hours, Patrick chambered his final round. Inside the bunker, one German officer remained, likely pressed against the concrete wall, trying to understand how his command had been decimated without a single visible threat. Patrick made his last calculation, accounting for the cumulative thermal expansion, the slight shift in wind, the mathematical certainty that angles don't lie. The crosshairs settled. The trigger broke clean. Officer 5 was down. Strong Point 7 went silent. The artillery umbrella that had killed 47 Americans collapsed. Patrick Wheeler worked the bolt one final time, cleared his chamber, and disappeared into the Italian winter, leaving behind only the mystery of 5 dead officers and a bunker full of Germans who would spend the rest of the war wondering if they'd been killed by a man or a ghost. Subscribe to honor the soldiers whose names were erased by bureaucracy. If you prefer official lies over uncomfortable truths, keep scrolling. February 18, 1944. Captain Thornton Hayes sat across from Patrick Wheeler in a requisitioned farmhouse that smelled like mildew and old wine, a disciplinary report typed on official Army letterhead resting between them. unauthorized expenditure of 5 rounds of 30-06 ammunition, deviation from approved engagement protocols, failure to request proper clearance through chain of command. Hayes's West Point ring caught the lamplight as he tapped the document. "You're looking at a court-martial, Wheeler. I warned you about your carnival tricks." Patrick said nothing. Outside, the Rapido Valley was quiet for the first time in 2 weeks. 17 fewer men would die tomorrow because Strong Point 7 no longer existed as a tactical threat. Hayes didn't mention that. He mentioned regulations. But regulations couldn't stop what had already begun. Within 48 hours of Patrick's shots, 3 other corporals in different divisions requested permission to attempt structural deflection engagements against fortified positions. Within a week, a sergeant in the 36th Infantry successfully neutralized a machine gun nest using a ricocheted round off a church bell tower's iron support beam. By March, the technique had spread through enlisted ranks like wildfire through dry grass, passed soldier to soldier in foxholes and mess tents, sketched on cigarette packs and the backs of ration boxes. The officers called it the Ghost Doctrine because it killed enemies who never saw it coming and saved lives that official doctrine had written off as acceptable losses. They also hated it because it came from the bottom up, from pool hall hustlers and crane riggers who understood geometry better than West Point graduates understood their own manuals. Hayes filed his court-martial recommendation. It disappeared into some colonel's desk drawer, buried by the uncomfortable truth that Wheeler's 5 rounds had accomplished what 3 weeks of approved tactics couldn't. By April 1944, the Ghost Doctrine had been used to neutralize 89 fortified positions across the Italian theater. Allied casualty rates in assaults on hardened targets dropped by 34%. Not a single after-action report credited Patrick Wheeler by name. The technique was attributed to innovative field adaptations by forward elements in official communications, sanitized language that erased the corporal who'd proven that math trumped rank. Patrick didn't care about credit. He cared about the 381 names that stayed off the casualty lists, men who went home to Boston and Chicago and farm towns whose names he'd never know, men who lived because someone finally understood that the shortest path to a target isn't always a straight line. Hayes eventually dropped the court-martial when a general who'd lost a nephew at the Rapido asked pointed questions about why the officer corps was punishing the soldier who'd stopped the bleeding. Patrick Wheeler returned to his squad, his notebook, and the cold mathematics that kept turning impossible problems into solved equations. Comment, "I stand for the innovator if you're sick of bullies taking credit for the work of the little guy. Trolls and straight-line thinkers won't leave a word." Boston, Massachusetts, October 2003. Dr. Sarah Chen pulled a water-damaged notebook from a cardboard box in the basement of the Veterans History Project archive, expecting another collection of faded recipes and hometown addresses. Instead, she found geometry, pages of calculations, deflection coefficients, thermal expansion tables, and a crude diagram drawn on what appeared to be a Lucky Strike cigarette pack, carefully preserved between 2 sheets of wax paper. The notebook belonged to Patrick Wheeler, died 1987, age 65, cause listed as emphysema. No Purple Heart, no Silver Star. One grandson who donated his grandfather's effects and mentioned something about the old man's war math that nobody understood. Chen was a ballistics researcher specializing in unconventional engagement tactics, and what she was reading shouldn't have been possible in 1944. She cross-referenced the calculations against modern Special Forces doctrine. The deflection angles matched techniques currently taught at Fort Bragg under the classified designation Indirect Structural Engagement, ISE protocols developed, according to official records, by JSOC in 1997, except Patrick Wheeler had solved the same equations 53 years earlier using a borrowed protractor and the back of his cigarette pack. Chen spent 3 months tracking down veterans of the 34th Infantry Division. She found a retired colonel named Frank Morrison, Jr., son of the sergeant who died at the Rapido. He remembered stories his father's squad mates told at the funeral. They talked about a kid named Wheeler who could shoot around corners. We thought it was war stories, the kind of stuff old soldiers make up. You're telling me it was real? It was real. Chen found after-action reports that mentioned unexplained casualties in fortified positions, German documents recovered from archives in Berlin describing Geisterfire, ghost fire, that killed officers in supposedly secure bunkers, Allied casualty statistics showing a 34% reduction in deaths during assaults on hardened targets between February and June 1944, an anomaly that military historians had attributed to improved artillery support. But it wasn't artillery. It was a pool hall hustler from Boston who understood that concrete walls were just geometry problems with 3-inch solutions. Chen published her findings in the Journal of Military History in 2004. The article noted that Patrick Wheeler never received formal recognition for pioneering a technique that would save an estimated 381 lives in World War II and countless more in modern special operations. His name appeared in no training manuals. His court-martial recommendation, however, remained in his service file until Chen's research forced the Army to issue a posthumous commendation in 2006. Patrick Wheeler's grandson attended the ceremony. He brought his grandfather's notebook, the cigarette pack still tucked between pages of calculations. He never talked about the war, the grandson said. He just said that straight lines were for rich men and poor men had to learn the angles. Chen understood then that some truths don't need official recognition. They just need someone willing to do the math. If you value results over red tape and truth over official history, subscribe to our channel. Only those who side with the erasers of history would refuse to support this story.